to get started here, first and foremost, thank you for taking the time to come here. I know your time is valuable, and it's humbling to see how many people are here. So hopefully, this catalyzes great things for this parish. So let's jump into it. This is the first of 4 classes on the Foundations series. So I left off my conversion talk talking about worldviews, so that's what we're going to pick up right here. So every society possesses with more or less strength a moral and spiritual, imaginative, ruling vision, aka a worldview, right? A set of assumptions, a way of looking at things. And this vision is usually holistic, and it orders the most meaningful, deep questions that you could ask for society, especially, right? So not only the moral code, but also an accepted ideal about the good person, clear categories of success and failure. It assigns political, social, and economic values and priorities and laws and ordinances, legal codes, manners, customs, even modes of entertainment, right? All these things, they're downstream from a society's ruling imaginative vision. But here's the thing, in a vigorous civilization like our own, this vision is usually settled, and the longer it's settled, the more deeply and unconsciously it is assumed, it's taken for granted, and it's not argued from. It's just argued. It's not argued for. It's argued from. So, such a ruling vision. This is where our personal actions are all downstream, because whether we like it or not, we're conditioned and programmed in a certain way to take these assumptions, take that vision, and integrate them into our own life, and that's usually the basis, our default setting for our own worldviews, right? So each individual derives its own inner narrative of life that assigns meaning and purpose and direction from this broader societal worldview, right? So often this personal narrative, again, is assumed. It's unconscious. People are under the influence of a set of first principles that are often hidden away in their minds and argued from, rather than discussed and rather than critiqued. So obviously, what if this vision is wrong? What if it's problematic? What if it's destructive, right? I would argue that we're kind of seeing that play out today, right? It's no secret that things are rough out there. There's societal decay, there's corruption, all the institutions that are forming our opinions on these things, moral decay, and also just a radical deviation from the values that really built the Western world, right? So here's the thing. Even the academic institutions that are supposed to guard and militate against this, they're conspicuously unaware of these ruling visions and the assumptions that they're bringing to the questions of the day. So this course, it's taking on a clarifying role. I'm presenting, hopefully, a charitable and intellectual counter worldview, a counter vision to that prevailing secular worldview that surrounds us today, right? We're bombarded with it. So I, of course, contend that the Catholic worldview, one that's illuminated by faith and reason, is the true narrative of life. And of course, the Catholic worldview, any worldview, it's going to show us, as we're going to see, who we are, who God is, what His purposes for us are, how we've gotten into our current state, what God's doing about it, what's coming in the future, and basically what it all boils down to is how we should live right now. So that's worldviews in general. Worldviews in specific. All worldviews, all philosophies of life, ethics of life, they're basically a response in an interaction between these 3 things. God, His existence, the question of happiness, we all desire fulfillment, perfection, etc., but also the problem of suffering and death. To the academic, actually all these can be grouped into the question of happiness, but this is going to be our frame, this is going to be our methodology. This first class today, we're going to cover and tackle and complete the first one, God's existence, and we're going to introduce the question of happiness. So it's ambitious, right? Usually I cover this stuff with high schoolers in 2 months. So I'm going to condense it all, or at least 3 weeks worth of that into one class right now. And it's ambitious, but hopefully you bear with me. This first class might be a tiny bit longer than an hour, and the other ones, I can assure you, I'll keep that under an hour, but there's a lot that I got to cover here. So hopefully it's memorable. I do have a really distinct and memorable process by which I walk us all through this. And it, bore great fruit with my high school students. So let's get started. This may seem arbitrary, but I have a very calculated reason for covering this. It's going to be an interpretive key by which we can greater appreciate the answers to these questions, the worldview. So can anyone can anyone in here differentiate philosophy from theology? You hear these terms all the time. Does anybody know the difference? Any thoughts? What's philosophy? Reason, right. Means of cognition. That's perfect. So philosophy is the body of knowledge that we can know through reason alone. It's a study of reality, study of the created order through reason alone. So hopefully that illuminates, what's theology? How do we know theology? By faith, and we study divine revelation. So theology is that body of knowledge that we can know by divine revelation, or called supernatural knowledge, right? So you have knowledge from on high, knowledge from on low. When you see Plato discussing whether the soul exists after death, that's a philosophical inquiry. When you see Moses in the book of Exodus, revealing the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, like he's elaborating divine revelation, divine truths, right? So, here's the key. Aquinas says that philosophy and theology, they are distinct, not divided, not contradictory. This is key. Aquinas was key for synthesizing faith and reason. Maybe that sounds familiar because all the philosophers and theologians since, including Pope St. John Paul II, have done the same. But this is crucial because you see this play out today too. How many times do you hear a scientific truth contradicts a theological truth? Or like a scientific truth like evolution disproves the existence of God. That betrays a sophomoric, immature understanding of God, as we're going to see play out here. But the truth is that they can never contradict each other, because Aquinas was reacting to that same problem. The Averroists, French philosophers in his time, were pitting philosophical truths against those theological truths. And that upset him, and he thoroughly refuted that powerfully, stating God is the author of both. And what we're going to find is that philosophical truths are the preambles to divine truth. For example, if we know that we have a soul, if we know we're differentiated from the rest of creation, if we know that God exists, what does that mean for us? What are the implications of that? Why? What is it? You're going to see how theology builds upon reason. So that's this, and that's going to be a crucial key going through this course, and it's going to be a very memorable interpretive key, or a hermeneutic, by which you guys better understand and appreciate the Catholic worldview. So theology, simply the exposition, the scientific exposition of divinely revealed truths, enabled and empowered by the supernatural virtue of faith. The science of God, the study of God. That could be the study of God through nature, observing nature in the created order, the cosmos, or it could be through divine revelation, like the church, magisterial text, scripture, that. So let's practice that a little bit. You tell me if this is a philosophical truth or a theological truth. God exists. This is a big one. What do you think? Are we talking theology here? Is this like strictly Bible, divine revelation, the church? Or could you know this from reason alone?
Oh.
Very good answer. Yeah, you guys are on top of things already, because that was supposed to be the controversial one. But yes, it's actually technically a philosophical truth, and I'm going to show that in a second. How about God is one, or there's one God? Also philosophy. Yep, you can know that by reason alone. Humans and animals are different from each other. Obviously philosophy and reason alone. Yep. Heaven and hell. Theology, right? Do not steal, a moral imperative. Can you know that by reason alone, or is that something that we need divine revelation for?
I think reason.
Yeah, that's reason, natural law. God is different from creation.
What?
Right, he's got it. It's locked in. Jesus is the Son of God. That's a theological truth. You need the supernatural virtue of faith to believe that. How about God is a Trinity? Theological. And lastly, that there are moral laws. Objective, normative, moral laws. Philosophy. Yep, our whole nation was built on that, actually. The natural law. So, obviously, the existence of God, it has enormous implication, makes an enormous difference in how we perceive the world, ourselves, our relation with each other, right? It's foundational to developing a coherent worldview. This is our launching off point, and maybe, I was anticipating maybe some of you would be stuck from that last slide and be like, how on earth is the existence of God a philosophical truth, something that you can know from reason alone, right? And as you guys, answered correctly, you can know it from both ways. You could read Scripture, you could come under the conviction that God exists from reading Scripture, or maybe even a moment in adoration, or hearing the Pope preach, or any one of these ways that's related to divine revelation. But also, it can be known from reason, from our experience of the world of nature and looking at the explanation. So let me ask you this, that God can be proven by reason alone. Is that a self-evident truth? Is it obvious? Is it something that, like a 2 + 2 = 4, no reasonable human being would deny that? Can the same be said about the existence of God? Is it
No.
self-evident? No, it is not. So, no, it's not known immediately. It's not obvious. We have to reason our way along to the conclusion through logical demonstration, and many people fall along the way, fall away from that logical journey because it takes serious, rigorous intellectual work. It's not easy, and I've studied this for a long time, and what I'm about to kind of breeze through a little bit, it took me a while for it to really click, but you get that light bulb moment, and it's like, whoa, there's got to be something that we call and refer to as God that has to exist by reason alone. And so I just claim that we can know God's existence through reason alone from a scientific examination of our experience with the natural world. That's a huge claim. So how do we go about that? This philosophical, metaphysical principle, this is like philosophy 101, one of the biggest axioms in philosophy in Latin. It's called operatio sequitur esse. Operation follows being. What you do proceeds from who you are. Or in like layman's terms here, we can know something about the cause from the effects. And I think we can all think of examples on, how this plays out in our normal life. For example, if you're driving down 110 here and you see, a big billowing cloud of smoke in the distance, you can infer safely that, there's a fire. There's a fire causing that smoke, right? Even though you can't see it. Likewise, on that picture on the left there, you can experience a sore throat, a headache. You can't see it, but you know that you have a virus, right? It's invisible. You can know an invisible cause from its visible effects, right? So the same thing basically for God in the created order, the cosmos, nature. We don't see God, as we'll figure out here soon. He's immaterial, he's pure spirit. We don't see God with our senses, with our eyes, but from our experience with the natural world and applying reason to deducing arguments and explanations from the natural created order, we can come to understand that God needs to exist. So let us do that. Let us consider the created order. Let us examine reality, nature. And in order to make this intellectual work extremely easy for us, we can just turn to St. Thomas Aquinas' famous 5 ways. I mean, how many of you have heard of St. Thomas's 5 ways? Just a handful, right? Very intimidating stuff, right? This is the rigorous, serious intellectual work that I was talking about. But these are all purely philosophical arguments. I know St. Thomas, he's the common doctor of the church, in my opinion, the smartest guy to ever live, right? But all these arguments that he makes, they're all strictly rational, philosophical arguments for the existence of God. And they're also the most famous set of arguments. You go to many universities, any solid philosophy program, like even secular universities, they're going to cover Aquinas and his 5 ways, hopefully, right? And after 800 years, these arguments, they've stood the test of time. New atheists like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, they don't touch this. They can't grapple with these things in a good faith, honest, intellectual way. Like to this day, these arguments stand. And even Scripture alludes to you can know the existence of God through a careful observation and deductive reasoning of the created order. Romans 20 right there, right? So, it tells us that even human beings that haven't encountered Christ, haven't encountered Scripture, they can know that God exists from their experiences and rational reflections upon the natural world. And actually, there's a saint in our tradition, Saint Josephine Bakhita, I believe. I'm kind of doing this off the top of my head. But I believe she reasoned her way to the existence of God, and then later in her life, I think made contact with like a Catholic missionary in Africa, and she's canonized a saint. So these 5 ways, they're going to build our picture of God. So disclaimer, I just told you, like this is dense philosophy, metaphysics. Usually people that grapple with this stuff, they have some base understanding in philosophy and metaphysics. But for that reason, I'm just going to give you a little taste with the first way. I'm going to breeze through the second, third, fourth, and then I'm going to really hone in on the fifth way. The fifth way is the key. That's what we're going to really harness the momentum off as we explore worldviews. So, the first way, argument from motion. Things move or change. Nothing moves or changes itself. There cannot be an infinite regress of moved movers. And so there must be some unmoved mover, and this is what we call God. So like I said, I'm going to give you a little detailed explanation. Father Peter right now is handing out these. If you're interested, not everybody needs, if you don't want one, don't take one, but if you're actually interested in like the detailed argumentation of these arguments, they're right here. So I'm going to give you a taste of that with this first one. So our senses, they prove that some things are in motion. And think of motion here not as locomotion, as people and bodies and physical things move space to space, but think of it as change, right? So changing in place, changing in quality, changing in size, etc. Number two, things move when potential motion becomes actual motion, and only an actual motion can convert a potential motion into an actual motion. So what's being said here? So motion is the movement from a potentiality to an actuality, right? So for example, I have the potential to learn French. I don't actually know French, but I have the potential to learn French, and I need to learn from somebody who actually knows French. I can't teach myself. So nothing, therefore, can move itself. Same thing with the leaves on trees, right? They're either red, orange, yellow. There needs to be a change that acts upon that leaf in order for it to change its color. So the key here in this argumentation is the sequence of motion cannot extend to infinity. So Thomas Aquinas spends forever elaborating and articulating this point, but essentially there can't be an infinite regress of movers. If the whole chain of moving things had no first mover, I mean, it could not now be moving as it is. If there was an infinite regress with no first mover, no motion could ever begin, and if it never began, it could not go on and exist now. But it does exist now, therefore it is necessary that to arrive at a first unmoved mover, put into motion by no other, and this everybody understands to be God. So, I mean, I could spend an hour going through this, but that's a little taste of the first way. The second way stems from Aristotle. This is other, philosophy 101. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all this, but in determining what a thing is, there's four causes that you consider: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Material is the stuff, what it's made of. The formal cause is the idea, how is it formed. The efficient cause is the agent that brings this thing into being. And the final cause, this is the most important one, this is what the fifth way is going to articulate: the purpose, the goal, the end for which it exists. That's the most defining feature of determining what a thing is. So if we're speaking about efficient causes, we all experience the principle of cause and effect. There must be an initial first cause or an uncaused cause, which we call God. And nothing is ever the efficient cause of itself. I didn't bring myself into being. I know my parents did bring themselves into being, right? Nothing ever brings itself into being. So if something brought itself into being, it would not exist before itself, which is a logical impossibility. It violates the philosophical logical principle of non-contradiction, right? So basically, you do the same thing. You can't go through an infinite regression of efficient causes, and ultimately you arrive at a first cause, an uncaused cause. So that's the second way, a little snapshot of that. The third way, this is the one that took me forever to really grasp, but then I remember the defining moment when I apprehended it, and again, it's like this great luminous light bulb moment, and it's beautiful. So this is the argument from contingency. The third way observes all things to be contingent, which is to say that all things have not always existed and might not always exist. They depend on something other than itself. There must be something that is not contingent and is responsible for the existence of all contingent things. One thing must remain always the same, and this is God, the necessary being. So trees, homes, leaves, rocks, rivers, all these things, they come and go, right? Yet, if this was the case absolutely, then at some point, nothing would have existed, and thus nothing could come to be. But this is impossible because we observe that things do exist. Therefore, we have to arrive at a non-contingent necessary being. And yes, I know a lot of this is, over the heads, but there's a calculated reason. There's a method to the madness, I assure you. I'm going to get to that. So this actually adds to the notion of God that his essence is his existence, and that he's self-subsistent. Fourth way, argument from degrees of being. This one's a little easier to understand. The fourth way observes a gradation in all things. Some things are better than others. There's the best of everything in every class. So when it comes to existence, something must be the best. With regard to all things that exist, there must be one that exists in the greatest and best way, and one that is existence itself, and this is God. So in all of our lives, we come across goods, right? And we order them according to, things are better or less better than others. Unless this ranking is false, there has to be a real standard of perfection, right? To make such a hierarchy possible. Because a thing is ranked on an order of hierarchy only insofar as it's closer to the standard, the ideal, the most perfect. So unless there's a most perfect being, the real standard of perfection, all of our value judgments are really vain. They're meaningless, they're impossible. That's the essence of this argument. So now we arrive at the last one, and this is probably the easiest to comprehend, but also simultaneously the most powerful. And I'll quick read this. The fifth way appeals to the complexities of creation and the design found within it. Nature displays order and design everywhere. Therefore, there must be one who designed the cosmos, a universal designer, and this is God. So, real simple argumentation here. The major premise is that where there is design, there has to be a designer. Minor premise, we observe design existing in the universe, in the cosmos. Conclusion, there must be a universal designer. And I would say that the minor premise here is self-evident, but that's actually always the one that's most attacked, that there's design in the universe. We observe seashells, they display mathematical proportionality. The human eyeball, it's an amazingly efficient instrument for vision, right? The human brain, it's one of the most complex pieces of design in the known universe. It's like a supercomputer. Even the tilt of the Earth's axis provides optimal seasonal change for life. Obviously there's design. So let me illustrate this with the famous watchmaker argument. And a really interesting side note, I taught at St. Thomas Academy the last 2 years, and I would start the year kind of with this unit where I'm talking about natural theology or proving the existence of God through reason alone. And I'd take them through all of this that I'm going to share with you tonight. And then at the end of the year, months and months later, I would give them a pop quiz and a blank sheet of paper, and it's all for extra credit. And they have to prove the existence of God through reason alone to really offer a true test to see what they retained from early in the year. It's a little teacher hack right there. And it turns out it wasn't for extra credit, but but it gives you a really good gauge on what they're really retaining, right? I'd say 90% of them articulated that three-pronged argument for the universal designer argument as well as this watchmaker argument. Literally 90% listed it perfectly. And then of course your overachievers would list the unmoved mover, uncaused cause, the necessary non-contingent being, the standard of perfection. All the other arguments, right? But so anyways, this is a powerful one. So suppose you're walking in the desert and you see this luminous, beautiful golden watch just laying there in the sand. Would you assume that bits of sand rubbed together to form the gears, the crystals, the hands, the levers, the wristband, all by chance? Or would you observe the intricate design of the watch and infer that there must have been a designer that crafted it, right? It's really that simple. Another example would be, say you're flying over a deserted desert island, and in the beach you see SOS written, right? Would you suppose that the wind wrote that by chance? Or that somebody with intelligence, designed and wrote it? Or further, what if you looked further on the island and you observed someone built a hut with doors and windows and a fireplace, right? Would you think a hurricane randomly arranged those rocks and everything? I think you guys get the point. And the point is, you immediately infer a designer when you observe design. I'll skip that anthropic principle argument. That's interesting. If you're curious, you can look that up or talk to me after the class. But that's a closely related argument that observes design. So, like I said, we're building a picture of God. We went through the 5 ways that our notion of God certainly exists, and we're gradually learning about God's nature, or essence. And what is an essence? It's that which distinguishes a thing from everything else. It's the basis and origin of all of its properties. So, the 5 ways ultimately converge in the notion of being. God is being itself in all of its fullness, Therefore, God's essence is his existence. We infer that from the first argument as well as the third. In fact, he's the only being whose essence is to exist, existence. All of us, we participate in existence. Everything created participates in existence. That maps onto that third argument from contingency. So God, he's the first principle. He's the principle by which all things proceed, by which all things are sustained. As you can see, we're filling in certain qualities about God's essence here from these 5 arguments. And perhaps that sheds light on this famous passage that I wrote there from Exodus. You know, when God reveals his name, I am who am. I mean, there's a lot of different interpretations, there's depth to that, there's layers to that, but most obviously and fundamentally, it's speaking that God is being itself, right? He can't be articulated by like a finite participatory claim. But I am who I am, that speaks to that fullness of being. His essence is his existence. He is being itself. So, also, we can continue building our picture through more and more, deductive reasoning, deducing necessary attributes, and these are called the divine attributes. Maybe some of you have heard of the divine attributes. Usually, commonly, there's 10 of them. Some philosophers will point out 12. Again, this is all reason, philosophy alone. And in a sense, all of these are contained, once again, in these 5 ways. And by the way, there's way more than 5 ways to rationally demonstrating the existence of God. I think there's up to like 40 of them, but these were just Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. And it's also worth saying that these divine attributes, they're just different ways of talking about the one and same reality. Although we distinguish God's attributes in our human language, they're not distinct in reality. God is his eternity, which is his intelligence, which is his will, so on. You get the point. So, once again, I'm going to breeze through these real quick. But these are all, again, attributes that God must possess, again, by reason alone, philosophy alone. As, by the way, Aristotle figured all this out 3-4 centuries before Christ, before the incarnation, with no exposure to, the religion of the Jewish people in the Old Testament, etc. So number 1, God is spirit. And again, I'm going to be brief. I'll cruise through these. God is spirit. He's not a material being. He's not a body, not a composition of anything. He's pure spirit. And this flows from matter implying potentiality. Bodies are always limited. They're subject to change. And to be subject to change involves non-being. God is simple. He doesn't have parts. In layman's terms, he just doesn't have parts. No kind of composition, whether physical or metaphysical, it's out of the question. Again, this flows from the third argument, from contingency. If God is the non-contingent necessary being, you can't depend on anything else in the created order to exist, including something that would unite parts to a single whole, right? That's the nature of a body or a machine, right? There's interdependent parts. So God is simple. And also you can base this on the first argument, is pure actuality. Pure act is incompatible with any kind of composition. So maybe I'm piquing the curiosity for philosophy here, because this stuff sounds pretty dry and stale, but it's incredibly illuminating, especially when you're thinking about how we think about God versus, how culture presents God. And I'll touch on that in a sec too. God is perfect, can't improve, lacking nothing. He contains in himself all perfections. This flows, believe it or not, from the unmoved mover argument, that first one, as well as, of course, the fourth one. He's a standard of perfection by which we can judge degrees of being. Aristotle actually coined this one. He noted that to be perfect is to be fully actualized. If I could run faster than I'm currently running, then I'm not running perfectly. God is good. Aristotle again defines good, which was inherited by the entire Western philosophical tradition ever since. Good is defined as something desired. God is greater than all things, so God is the greatest good, and he's also the source and the standard by which we perceive things to be good. A distinguishing feature of Catholic teaching is that everything that is created is good, but they're not the good. They're not goodness itself. They participate and point to God, who is goodness itself, being itself. So God is good. God is infinite. He's not limited by time, by space, by any form of finitude. He's the fullness of being. Why? Because limitation involves non-being, and of course we already covered that with God's infinity, right? God is one. So this is a big one, and I could talk about this for a half an hour because this one's probably most under threat. But God is one. There's only one God, and this is Thomas Aquinas offers the 1-2 punch here based on God's simplicity and infinity. Since God is without parts, he can't be divided, right? God is infinite, he's unbounded. So can there be many gods? Obviously not. We've already seen that God has to exist without limit. And if he's without limit, there can't be another God, because if there was, there'd be a difference between them, and this would involve non-being. You know, the one could not be what or where the other is, and that would mean neither one could be the limitless fullness of being. So God is one, a maximum indivisibility, unity. There can only be one unmoved mover, one uncaused cause, one first cause. God is one. So boom, there in 45 seconds, just refuted all the polytheistic religions, right? God is omnipresent. He's not limited to space. You know, mapping onto this, God is not limited necessarily. If we conceive of God properly, he cannot have any limitations, as we're deducing, right? So that includes places, spatial dimension, right? He's present always and everywhere, and actually more precisely, it would be God is present to all of creation, and that's called divine immanence. God is immutable. This one might be the most controversial, right? God in his essence, he cannot change. The implications for this you could draw out and I could talk about in depth, but God doesn't have emotions. When you see God angry or wrathful in the Old Testament or something, that's anthropomorphic language to express a reality about that relationship between man and God. God is not actually angry because appetites, passions, emotions, that implies change. If there's change, there's unactualized potential. We already saw that was disproven in the unmoved mover, right? So he's already the best. He cannot change. He cannot mutate because change entails a lack of perfection. This flows from like 3 of those 5. God is eternal, so not measured by time, because time, again, is intimately related to change. So God is without beginning, without end. In God, there's nothing past, as if it were no longer, nothing future, as if it had not yet been. So in God, there's only kind of the eternal now. Everything is present. This will actually have implication on prayer. If any of you ever read any books about saints, sometimes it catches us off guard when God will apply the merits of prayer at different parts in time. For example, I right now could pray for the repose of the soul of my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And God could foresee that because everything is present to God in the eternal now, and apply those graces to my great-great-great-great-grandfather back in time, based on the merits of what he foresaw, I would do in the now. So there's implications to these things, but that's an aside, that's theology. We're not there yet. So God is eternal, not measured by time. And then of course, God is intelligent. This is a necessary attribute that follows from that 5th way, the universal designer. Basically, I'm not going to articulate all this, but we see in nature complexity. We see an intercorrelation of part with part, something referred normally to as a plan, right? There's a designing plan. There's an intelligence in the created order. God is omniscient and omnipotent. So those are actually Latin. So omni means all potent means powerful, omniscient means all-knowing. So basically there's all-knowing, all-powerful. There can't be any barrier to God's operative knowing and acting. And then speaking of that, if God's intelligent, and those are his, if there's design, if God's intelligent, and he's omniscient and omnipotent, that would, imply his operative attributes. Everything we just covered before are called entitative attributes. So they follow from God's very inner being. But when God acts, knowledge and love, everything outside of God is a function of his love. And the most brilliant professor that I ever had in my graduate theological studies taught the Trinitarian theology course. And his simple yet really rich definition of God is nothing more than an eternal act of knowing and loving. And thought I'd share that. God is intelligent. He has rational faculties just like we do. That's one of the ways that we're made in the image and likeness of God. But he knows and he loves. All right, so that concludes all the divine attributes, and I know I just hit you with a lot there. But I'm going to pivot, and by the way, I will give you guys a break coming up here in a second. But I want to pivot to a 6th argument that's particularly powerful, and that is this: God and objective morality. So think about this. Can objective moral norms exist in an atheistic worldview? For example, Could the atheist say that rape is always objectively wrong, regardless of intention and circumstance, and that we're morally bound to observe that moral norm?
No.
I mean, you could take that to prayer, or that'd be a really philosophical prayer, but there's a profound realization there, right? So there needs to be a transcendent grounding. So here's the argument for the affirmative, and my high schoolers really resonated with this because it makes sense, right? So real moral obligation is a fact, and this moral obligation, it's deeper than just a perceived sense of I subjectively feel like rape is wrong. But no, there's something more, that we're really truly obligated, that our duties arise from the way that things really are, and not simply from our desires or our own subjective dispositions. So number 2, either the atheistic or the religious view, the theistic view, is correct. 3, the atheistic worldview is incompatible with moral obligation. So atheists, they never tire of claiming that human beings are nothing but the chance products of matter and motion. That's blind to purpose, blind to human striving. So 4, therefore, religious view is correct. Moral obligation is grounded in our Creator. It's rooted in the fact that the created order is intelligible, that things are created with purposes and ends, and morality is based on God's unchanging, eternal nature. So that's what morality is rooted in. It has to be rooted in the existence of what we can popularly conceive of as God. So anytime any of you have watched a YouTube debate between a Christian and an atheist, this is the go-to. The Christian will always try to back that atheist into that uncomfortable corner because everybody knows it's coming. This is always the go-to argument where the atheist has to concede that, no, something like rape or murder or infanticide is not objectively morally wrong. I can only subjectively feel like this is wrong. And it's always interesting to watch because that'll happen, that will unfold in every single debate between a theist or a Christian and an atheist. They always try to back him into that corner because there is no response to that. And sometimes they'll have the intellectual honesty to make that concession. Why? Because if atheists are right, then no objective moral values can exist. If God does not exist, everything is permissible ultimately, right? So, end note for this consideration, this is important too. I have not just said that atheists can't uncover, moral norms or moral goods. Obviously they can't. Sam Harris is a popular one. He's a modern atheist. He's on a lot of the political shows and everything. He's particularly known to be a particularly virtuous individual with his own subjective morals and everything. The question is, which account of the way that things are, better makes sense of these rules that we acknowledge. So atheists may know that some things are permissible and not permissible, but they don't know why. It doesn't have a grounding. They don't know why. So you can know something, but not why, right? So an analogy to that would be many modern scientists, right? They spend their entire life examining secondary causes, right? Without their whole lives acknowledging the first cause, God. As we've seen, these secondary causes, they could not be without the first cause, as we just saw, even though they can be known without knowing the first cause, God. So the same is true for morals. Just an interesting side note, interesting consideration. Again, this alone, because we all deeply, intuitively know that moral objective norms exist. For example, rape is always objectively wrong, independent of intention and circumstance. If you really flesh out the reasoning there, you have to arrive at some transcendent grounding or God, right? And this is one of these modern, atheists. He's actually a naturalist, Walter Stacey, who has the intellectual integrity to follow his worldview out to its logical conclusions. And this is brutal. I could quick breeze through this, but basically he's saying here that, since the world is not ruled by a spiritual being, but rather by blind forces, there cannot be any ideals, moral or otherwise, in the universe outside us. Our ideals, therefore, must proceed from our own minds. They are our own inventions. Thus, the world around us is us and nothing but immense spiritual emptiness. It's a dead universe, purposeless, senseless, meaningless. Nature is nothing but matter and motion. There's that matter and motion quip there. Governed not by any purpose, but by blind forces and laws. If the scheme of things is purposelessness and meaninglessness, then the life of man is purposeless and meaningless too. Everything is futile, all effort in the end is worthless. A man may, of course, still pursue disconnected ends, but his life is hollow at the center. That's depressing stuff, right? But I actually applaud this. You want to know why? Because he has the intellectual integrity to actually, like I just said, follow his worldview out to its logical conclusions. Because like it or not, many people around us in our lives today, especially the youth, they have this worldview, but they don't know it because they are just pushing it aside, they're ignoring it, they're not fleshing out the conclusions like Mr. Walter Stacy did here. So I think that was worth seeing because that is the logical, conclusion. All right, so the key takeaway here, right? We built a picture about God. We showed that something that we conceive of as God must exist. We did this through reason alone. We deduced necessary attributes, qualities pertaining to his essence, all from reason, philosophy alone. He's the first principle, the first cause, the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause, the perfect, necessary being, the standard of perfection, and the universal designer. We know he's pure actuality, that he's being itself, his being is his existence, etc., right? The defining feature, as it relates to our searching out of a worldview, is that fifth argument, that universal designer argument, and that is teleology. That could be your word for the day, all right? That's a philosophical term, teleology. What am I referring to there? Intelligibility, design, goal-directedness, purpose. These things exist in the created order, all right? That flows from that fifth argument. And how does that relate to us? Well, believe it or not, man too. We are created with a purpose, an ultimate end. There is meaning and a destiny that we have for life, right? This understanding of this purpose, this ultimate end, that goal is the driving question, the answer to which forms the beating heart of a coherent worldview. That is the answer to the meaning and purpose of life, right? Goal-directedness, purpose, intelligibility, these things are present in creation. We exist in creation. We too have a purpose, an ultimate end. It isn't chance. So that is the big takeaway from everything I just covered. And a cool little end note here before we take a break. My kids, my students, the last 2 years loved this. It's a Latin phrase that they all remembered, again, one of those pop quizzes at the end of the year. Exitus reditus. That's a Latin phrase that means everything comes from God and then everything returns to God. So I'm stepping away from philosophy there with that latter part. That's actually a theological truth, that everything returns to God. But it's actually quite beautiful. If you follow that trajectory from God, creation, and man, that's what we just did with philosophy there. That's truths accessible by reason alone. But then man's return to God, that's where theology is going to step in. That's where we're going to go. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But the proceeding of all things from God and the return to God, it's like this cosmic boomerang, almost. That's kind of the phrase that my students really remembered, cosmic boomerang. And it's beautiful. And by the way, everything returns to God through man. So that's actually the reason and the basis for our personal dignity. So that's exitus reditus. And the last slide here before we take a really quick break, and then I'm just going to quickly introduce the question of happiness. I understand everything I just covered usually is going to come off as stale, as dry, as deeply, rigorously philosophical, metaphysical, but it would be foolish and superficial to disregard it. Why? Because these questions matter. Nothing matters more, if you really think about it, than if God exists because of the implications. And maybe some of that from the last section was over your head, new thoughts, new considerations, things you'll chew on, things you'll explore on your own. I don't expect you to retain literally any of that, any of the deeply metaphysical, philosophical, rational explanations for God's existence or his attributes. But with that said, there was a method to my madness, and I did have a purpose and a reason for sharing that with you. And that's twofold. First is just simply I'm trying to evoke a deeper thought, a curiosity about this, so that maybe you will go on your own and look at St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, or look into Dr. Ed Feser, a famous Thomist philosopher that writes about these things with great beauty. But more so, and this is my chess move, I want you to understand that there is serious intellectual rigor underlying the belief in God. to see that the wisdom on these matters, it's not uniquely Christian. It's not just some weird religious thing where we believe in God because the Bible tells us. But most fundamentally, it's within the reach of reason. And this is a lethal counter, a knife to the heart of what we all kind of commonly perceive to be the default disposition of people when they think about religion. Maybe you have family members that have this disposition. And that is, they just think that belief in God, it's blind and it's irrational. It's a psychological crutch to make us feel good about life when bad things happen, right? That's certainly the disposition that all my high schoolers came into class with, and I think it's safe to say that 99% of them don't have that anymore. Because the truth of what we just covered, again, it's accessible by reason alone. None of the New Age atheists really coherently in good faith grapple with any of that, that real intellectual muscle. So I wanted you to be exposed to that, at least get a taste of it, to know that there's something there behind our belief that's not just blind and irrational, right? And with my students, I'd actually turn the counters, because I would posit it would take way more faith to believe in a cosmos without a God, without a first cause. You know, in fact, that person can give no intelligible, coherent, comprehensive account of reality, of creation, of why there's something more than nothing, of, or explain how something has always existed without a first cause, right? Like, that's a conundrum that I would love to see solved, right? But it hasn't. So, not to mention, you saw that atheistic worldview, a worldview without a God, it's unlivable. It's depressing. It takes blind, irrational faith, I would posit, to believe in a worldview devoid of a God or a concept of the transcendent or something, right? So, an honest consideration of these arguments have produced actually a lot of Christian converts. Dr. Ed Fazer, like I just mentioned, is one of them. He was a hardcore atheist, PhD professor at college, and then kind of finally decided to give Thomas's 5 proofs, a chance, because he had brushed them off before, like all of them do. And that converted him, and now he's just an on-fire, robust, intellectual Catholic that's doing great things. He's written great books. So I hope you interacted with that with wonder, with reverence, and virtue of the sublimity of that topic. Again, I know that was kind of dry and stale, but the topic, we're talking about God, the existence of God, the implications. There's nothing more important that is worthy of your time and consideration. This stuff matters. If the God of classical theism exists, that is one heck of a truth, to grapple with. So let me ask you one quick thing here, and that is this. Why do you think many of us profess with some degree of certainty or another, profess that God is real, but few live it, few make the real significant changes in their life to reflect that reality? Any thoughts there? Why do so many people, if you asked, I'd say maybe 70% of people on the streets, they would say that they believe in some concept of God, but how many of them are actually centering their life on God and that reality and investigating it and conforming their lives to it? Yeah?
I think part of it is a lack of knowledge.
Lack of knowledge?
We have not been taught.
That exposure?
Yes.
Yeah.
And prompted to really dig in and decipher.
Yeah.
There's a knowledge, like you say. Reason tells us there's a logic, and things come from this and evolve from. And so you see the beauty, you see all the cyclical things, and you know that there's God. But then you take that to the next step without that deep conviction, and
Yeah.
because of the evil in the world today, it's easier to go the evil route. That's my sense.
It would require them to change too much.
Yeah. I'm on top of that. Father Peter, one.
I don't know that I can explain this very well, but I think it's also love.
Love.
Not being touched by love.
That is very insightful as well. Yeah. So I think what my dad, by the way, and Father Peter just spoke about is, faith is more than intellectual. The will is intimately involved as well. The will can actually put up obstacles that speak to the love part. So I always teach this, and this sticks. This is a recurring theme that I keep touching on, but 2 essential operative virtues that are needed to grapple with this stuff: humility and fortitude. Humility, because we need to be open, receptive, well-disposed for truth. If we think we're our own God and that we're everything, we're going to close ourselves off to this, right? We need that humility, that openness to say, hey, maybe I don't have it all figured out. Hey, maybe I am curious to like investigate the reasons by which some people believe in God. But more importantly, it's also fortitude that builds on that, right? So what happens in anything else that in life, if you apprehend a truth, what does that demand? A conformity to the will. If you really believe something is true, the will needs to follow suit, right? And many refuse to form a explicit, worldview, or refuse to grapple with these things because of that weight of implication, right? Discovering true meaning and purpose of life, discovering that God exists, that would demand an extreme conformity of the will, right? Which always involves sacrifice, suffering, hardship, discomfort, changed relationships, right? That new reorientation, that reorganizing of your priorities, it's painful, it's uncomfortable, and people shy away from that. And I think subconsciously, on some level, people know if they actually gave this a good faith shot and like actually dove into this stuff, they know where it's going to lead. It's going to lead to God exists, now I got to change my life, right? So I think people know that on some level subconsciously. They shy away from it because they don't have the strength of will yet, or the love, as Father Peter also gives insight, to make those changes, right? But that's why stories are such a powerful medium for these things, because like my own conversion story that I shared 2 weeks ago, it's worth it. I made those changes, I reoriented, recentered my life. Anyone that I know that has that similar story, every single one of them will tell you that it's worth it. It's worth the pain, the discomfort, the suffering, the self-sacrifice, that realignment. It's worth it. And that brings me to a life lesson that I can assure you, every single one of my high schoolers that I taught, this is probably what they remembered more than anything. And it's the most worthwhile pursuits you can ever do in life. They always entail that self-donation. They cost something, you're sacrificing for it. We all have glimpses of that. If you're a high schooler here and you're in, football or something, you take pride of being a part of a football team, right? You're giving yourself, you're expending energy and time and practice and weight room and diet and your grades, right? Or even children, right? Children, this is kind of the high point, naturally speaking, of this in life. Children, an enormous self-sacrifice is required if you're a good parent, right? But it is the most worthwhile thing you can do in this life because it brings the greatest joy and it's the most selfless act that you can possibly do, right? So the most worthwhile pursuits in life, they always cost something. And that brings me to this last point, very last point before we take a really quick break here, and then I'll wrap up real briefly introducing the question of happiness. Two types of people. You see this all around us play out, especially in the news and influencers and stuff. There's those that seek the truth and conform their wills to it, or there's people that try to conform the world and reality to their own subjective beliefs. That's a kind of unique way to think about this and how that humility and fortitude plays out in life. So that's kind of my pep talk to close this. The rest of the course is not going to be as philosophically dense as what I just did. So take a really quick break, and then I'll just close real quickly with the question of happiness. Thank you. I promise I won't keep you more than 15 minutes here, but this is where we transition to maybe the more interesting part of the entire course, right? So, where did we leave off? We left off establishing that man was created for an end, that there is indeed meaning and purpose to our life, that our desire for happiness is precisely our yearning for this actualization, this perfection of our being. One could call this an innate teleological urge, right? So in all times, in all places, happiness is inescapably among the most profoundly interesting subjects for human beings. Even all the greatest philosophers, they were all preoccupied. This was the dominant intellectual concern, the pursuit of happiness. So all men, we all necessarily will our own happiness. It's impossible for somebody to not will your own happiness, and we'll see how that makes sense later on. But it's an immutable feature inscribed in our human nature. So what is happiness? I guess a formal definition. It's a state whereby man will be so entirely, perfectly satisfied that there would be nothing left to desire. Basically, all of our deepest yearnings, our cravings, our desires, they are satiated, they come to a rest, they're exhausted, they find their object in which they rest, right? So this quest of happiness, it represents a note of unity harmony that ties together literally the sweep of all of man's doings. It's the thread that binds together all of our human activity. So you can see that this is the fundamental question that is going to illuminate the meaning and purpose of life. So consequently, the answer to this question will, establish rules and norms for what's referred to as the good life, right? So until man, until these yearnings, these desires, our quest comes to an end and we find the proper object, we're necessarily to some degree restless. We're searching, we're discontent. It's a feature of our being, right? Just as anyone feels a need for that which he lacks, physical, spiritual, or otherwise. So the question of happiness, there's a million questions that fall under this umbrella that kind of flesh out the realities of that search for happiness that we all have, right? So what is happiness? What are its constituents? Does God exist? What are the implications? Can man truly be happy? Is happiness even within our grasp? What are the implications? Is it accessible? What are the causes and conditions? I mean, you can go on the list here, right? You can see, how many intricate things are involved in this pressing existential question. So all these questions are generally grouped under that umbrella of the question of happiness. So man alone of earthly creatures actually cooperates in our achieving happiness, right? So through deliberate human action that engages both our intellect and will, we can either come closer to that ultimate end or we can deviate and militate against that path. Animals are moved to things by instinct and sense. Vegetative life is moved to things by physical necessity. But we are uniquely able to knowingly and freely cooperate in the full realization of what we are built for, what we are meant to be. So to attain our goal, to attain happiness, we need to know where we're going and how to get there. St. Thomas Aquinas called that order of execution and order of intention. So again, this may look a little philosophical, but it's a really simple concept, right? We just talked about we all have this yearning for happiness, for completion, for perfect fulfillment. That's formal happiness. That's what we all have, right? We all have that desire for happiness. But we can be mistaken about the material happiness. What good constitutes our happiness that can confer that happiness? That's material happiness. So it's possible for us to choose wrongly, perversely, frustrating that impulse that we have towards self-fulfillment. We can misconceive of the nature of the good that is suitable for us. So that's how you harmonize. We all desire happiness, but sometimes we can be fooled into thinking something is good, but it's not. We can misconceive of the nature of the good that's suitable for us. So once again, formal happiness, that's that immutable desire that we all have, that idea of happiness. Material is the good that can confer that happiness. We disagree with that. And I'm not going to read Aquinas there, but that's precisely what he says. We all desire happiness, but we can all disagree as to material happiness and the actual good that confers that happiness. So, the summum bonum, another Latin phrase for the day, the supreme good, the ultimate good, the most perfect good. This is what we refer to when we're talking about that greatest good that can confer perfect happiness. So, it's the determination of this good that really this whole question of happiness hinges, right? What's dependent upon this is the whole life of man, our destiny, the nature of all of our activity, our goals, our priorities, our values. Everything is downstream of what we in our life conceive of as that material happiness. That's summum bonum. So also, it sheds light on every single human action. In human beings, we're the type of human being, as human beings, we're the type of creatures that can have goals, that can have ends. And not only that, but we nest goals within goals, right? If my summum bonum in life, my greatest good, my whole life was oriented towards, making the NBA, I would set proximate goals to reach that ultimate goal, right? I'd try out for the basketball team, I'd establish good relationships with the coach, I'd be well behaved, I'd do good in school, I'd hit the weight room, I'd eat healthy, etc. A humorous example here, and this is okay with her that I do this. But, say your greatest goal in life, your summum bonum, is to befriend Father Peter, right? Maybe you would be the highest bidder on a golfing excursion with him, like one-on-one time. And maybe as a more, proximate goal to achieve that remote goal, you take private golf lessons so you don't humiliate yourself during that time, right? Right. We all love you, love lights, right?
And holding your baby.
Yeah, I should have played that differently. So that's the summum bonum. That's the greatest good that we can all, we have disagreements on. We can misconceive of it. We can be wrong in our judgment, right? But there's one summum bonum, one true summum bonum, ultimate supreme good, that can confer that happiness that we all desire. So as I just said, there is one dominant, all-encompassing aim of life. All other goods, all other things that we encounter in life exist within this hierarchy, reflecting that teleological structure of reality. What man pursues is ultimately, the master of his affections. Like I just said, his whole life is regulated by it. Values, priorities, goals, relationships, everything is downstream of that. So the proper conception of happiness and the summum bonum, and what man assigns as his ultimate good, that's the beating heart of a coherent worldview. That anchors your life, that orients your life. This is essential to a philosophy of life that gives meaning to all human endeavors, right? It encourages man's flourishing. So the implications, we got to search it out, right? And then consequently the rules and conditions that govern the good life and how we pursue that summum bonum, that ultimate good that can confer perfect happiness. So how we investigate the various type of goods that we encounter in life and we order them. That's what wisdom is. If you ever come across wisdom, the technical definition of that is simply being able to order things properly, right? So that's what morality is. So maybe you grew up with, in the era where you were taught that morality is just simply do this, don't do that. But believe it or not, there's a rich intellectual justification and foundation underlying that, and that is precisely, spoiler alert, for your own good, for your flourishing. If something helps you, if something helps you pursue that ultimate end and bring you closer to it, it's good. If something detracts you and makes you deviate from that path towards your summum bonum, that's bad. That's simply the moral life right there. So, all these rules and obligations that you hear about, in the moral theology, it's there for your own good, for your own flourishing, for your own peace, your own joy, for meaningful relationships, etc. So what happens if you misconceive of that summum bonum, like we just discussed? That's a possibility. We are human beings. We have free will. We have free choice. We have a duty to search out that summum bonum. What happens if we deviate from that? We get to kind of where we are today. A lot of very wise people have pointed out that the most pressing moral crisis is precisely this. Fulton Sheen actually coined this term, the existential angst of modernity. Pope Francis echoes this. He calls it existential poverty. But it's basically that, starvation for meaning, for purpose, for value, for objective truth, for true identity. You ask anyone in school, in college, young adults, this is what they're searching for, right? So symptoms of this is, an anxiety of living, an inability or refusal, as we saw, because the will is involved, to grapple with these questions, to answer what is it all about, why are we here? Really, what is the point of life? And if you're disconnected from that path, you're by definition living disordered lives that are accompanied by unhappiness, frustration, dissatisfaction, can lead to cynicism. You can spiral into despair, depression, mental anguish. My own story, I lived this to a certain extent. And basically just this persistent desire for more that the world just can't seem to give, right? And as we know, it's that desire for the true summum bonum that will perfect our being, that will exhaust all our desire, where we can find true happiness. An interesting consideration is we live in the Western world, especially in America. Prosperity, our quality of life, it's literally unparalleled in the human history, right? You have inner discontent, all those problems I just said. It's one of the most profound, and all the studies and literature bear this out. Why do you think that is? It should have been answered by kind of what I just said there, right? Yeah, Mary, you're right. Yeah, nice. Yeah, so, the goods of this world, they are indeed good, right? But wisdom, we need to put them in the right order. And the temptation is that they can very easily lead to excess and disorder, right? So virtue is needed to encounter and order and use these goods appropriately. They can become alluring distraction for pursuing man's ultimate end. So that's just a little interesting consideration, seeing how this actually translates concretely to what we observe in the lives of all of us around us, current society. And the good news, all right, we live in a world, like I just said, this worldview that's prevailing, it's secular, it's disconnected from God. It's devoid of anything transcendent, and it's unbearably suffocating. Like I said earlier, it's practically unlivable if you flush that out to its logical conclusions. And that prompts man to rethink and refocus his life, right? His priorities, his orientation. So when you screw up in life, like I've done a million times, when you misconceive of the good suitable for you, they serve as markers, right? They're markers on this road that communicate perfect happiness is not here, right? Like it's actually a feature of our nature that we can feel depression if we're disconnected from our true ultimate good, right? Or sadness, or, say you love the good of food and you stuff your face, and when reason tells you you need to stop, you keep going and then you feel like crap, right? That's nature's way of saying, like, you just kind of made food your God and you ate in a disordered way, right? So perfect happiness is not here. These are markers that we encounter in life that communicate perfect happiness is not here. So the good news is that nevertheless, the longing for happiness, that yearning for happiness, it's the great abiding concern of the human heart. Nothing can quench that flame fully. It persists because it's an immutable feature inscribed in us. We were created with this. And hopefully, the hope is that can prompt and catalyze that reorientation, that refocus. Maybe you'll start thinking about, life after death, or the God question, or any of these most important existential questions. And this also indicates, in a way, that God has actually already seized us. He's working in us at the root of our being, filling us with these deep longings for the eternal, the infinite, the transcendent. And right there is a little foreshadow to where we're going, because we're going to search out summum bonums, and we're going to see, what is the good that's suitable for us that can confer happiness, and how to think about that in a logical, reasonable way. And you can see how this is going to build into theology. It's going to complete the picture. And it's really powerful, and it's going to give you an intellectual foundation for defending, the faith that we profess. So, very last slide of the day here. Just real quick takeaways. We differentiated philosophy and theology, right? Philosophy is that knowledge that we can know by reason alone. Theology is the study of divine revelation through faith. We established that God exists and his necessary attributes from reason, philosophy alone. So faith isn't blind and irrational. It is rational. And then a defining feature of creation is teleology. A goal-directedness is present in every single piece of the created order. There is design, there is purpose, there is meaning, and man is no exception to that. We also have an end. We also have a purpose that is objective. And the question of happiness pursues that question. It searches for a fulfillment of that teleological urge that we have, because we all desire that deeply. You can't avoid it. But we can differ on the summum bonum, the object that confers, that perfect happiness. You see people living different lifestyles all around us. Some like money and fame and all these different, greatest goods that people orient their lives around. That's where we're going next week. So before we wrap up here, if you want those slides, what?
I have a question. Could you define existentialism for us mere mortals?
Existentialism?
You've used the term several times, but if
Existential is just like a blanket term that is like an umbrella underneath which is all the existential questions pertaining most immediately to reality, human nature, meaning and purpose, why there is something other than nothing, existence, right? Anything pertaining to existence. Okay. So if you want any of these slides, or if you want me to send you what I just presented, please email me. My email's on the church website. And lastly, this is my first time ever doing this, but I would like you to humbly request that you prayerfully consider donating, because a lot of changes are happening around OLL. Of course, I'm a new hire. We have some, new people on the staff here. We have really ambitious goals to really light the fire of the Catholic faith among our current, parishioners and school and students, but also outside of the community. We have, again, like I just said, ambitious aspirations for programming and establishing a youth program and updating some of the facilities. There's a lot of things that we have planned. And with that said, there's infrastructure needs, monetary needs, and we would be eternally grateful for any thoughtful donation, consideration to help us out to do this, to execute that vision. So there is a basket back there if you're interested in donating and to build programs like this, to host a Jeff Cavins, to bring in, if you think my presentation is decent, just wait till you hear Jeff Cavins. He's a pro. So again, we are deeply appreciative. I'm really appreciative and grateful for taking so much time. I know that went a little bit longer, but we covered a lot of ground there, and that by far was objectively more stale and dry content than you've probably ever been exposed to. We're going to get to the theology and Christ and salvation history eventually, and I'll definitely illuminate our faith in ways that maybe you've never heard before, but hopefully it'll stick, and hopefully this whole course will stick and help you, give an account for your faith to friends, family members, deepen your own relationship with God, etc. So, thank you. I'm always open to questions. If there's no more other questions, I'll be around to ask questions. So, thank you.